Well, hello everyone and welcome to a new video on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, right here in the United States of America. And we're going to talk about graphic novels, as they're called these days, or comic books, as they've always been called, because we're going to be talking about one of the most important characters in European comic books, of course. I'm talking about Hergé's Tintin, the reporter who hardly ever acts as a reporter, who is more of a detective and an adventurer, and who was created back in 1929 by Georges Remi, who published under the pen name of Herge. A few years ago, if you have been following the channel, you may remember that I began a brief overview of the Adventures of Tintin, and I published the first installment in a series of videos that was going to be a three-part series. But for some reason, it's taken me a long time to do the second part, and this is what we're going to do today. We're going to be picking up where we left off about 3 years ago and talk about the next few adventures of Tintin, and then in the future there'll be a third video in which we will talk about the final adventures. We had stopped back 3 years ago when around the mid-1940s, Herge was trying to escape the historical, social, political context of the mid-1940s by creating adventures that were in themselves escapist adventures. Talking about The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure, which was the last story that we talked about in that video. Of course, I will leave the description of that video under this video so that you'll be able to go back and watch that first installment in this three-part series about the Adventures of Tintin. If you live in the United States or in any English-speaking country and you would like to read the Adventures of Tintin, one good way to do it, I explain all of this in that first video. There's this edition by Little Brown and Company. That's one good way to access the Adventures of Tintin, but of course there are some adventures that are missing. Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Tintin in the Congo, and Tintin and Alf Art are not included in this 7-volume collection of Tintin books, but of course they have been translated, and you should be able to find them fairly easily. These are the translations into English that I have used in order to prepare this brief overview of the Adventures of Tintin for the channel. They're a little bit smaller than the usual albums, but they're manageable, they're portable, they're easy to take with you, and I enjoy having this 7-volume series, even though, as I say, it's not complete. You need to add to these 7 volumes Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Tintin in the Congo, and of course the unfinished adventure Tintin and Alf Art, all of which should be available, as I say, fairly easily. Picking up where we left off about 3 years ago, we need to talk about this adventure right here, the 7 crystal balls, which is the first part of this 2-part adventure, the 7 crystal balls and Prisoners of the Sun, which in French is called Le Temple du Soleil, so the Temple of Sun, or the Sun Temple, but the translation into English is Prisoners of the Sun. They probably thought that the Sun Temple was not a great title, and so they changed it. For the 7 crystal balls and Prisoners of the Sun, Hergé enjoyed the greater freedom that a 2-part story allowed, because The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure was also a 2-part story, and I feel like Hergé really enjoyed the greater freedom that a 2-part story allowed and returned to this format for the next adventure, and he would again for the future lunar adventure that he would draw a few years later. In The Seven Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, the author is dabbling in the occult with the idea of the curse of Raskar Kapak, but he counterbalances this idea of the occult with the more realistic explanation for the malady of the members of the Sanders-Hardtmuth expedition to South America, which is to be found in the content of those mysterious 7 crystal balls. These expeditioners fall ill when they return to Europe from their archaeological trip. And it's not really a supernatural reason why they are sick and why they have all these health issues, but it's the content of those 7 crystal balls. Professor Calculus, you can see him at the very center of the cover of that album. He, by now, was a fairly new character. He had appeared for the first time in the previous adventure, but he already becomes an integral part of the story when he is kidnapped. This will lead Tintin and Captain Haddock, and Snowy, of course, Milou, to South America. The scenes at the villa owned by Professor Tarragon, or Bergamote in the original French, in The 7 Crystal Balls, are, in my opinion, among the most memorable in this adventure and in all of the Adventures of Tintin. Hergé here is able to create a stifling atmosphere, an undeniable sense of doom that really is mirroring the events of World War II, which were the contemporary events that Hergé was living through, that the world was living through, and that would have important and really negative consequences for Hergé, both personally and professionally. The end of the war, World War II, actually brought innumerable problems for Hergé, who was blacklisted for having published Tintin in the Nazi-controlled newspaper Le Soir. The publication of this adventure was stopped until Raymond Leblanc came to Hergé's rescue and helped him found Tintin magazine, where Hergé and others who collaborated, but Hergé was able to complete the story. The story of the 7 Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun was stopped. The publication of it was stopped after the liberation of Belgium, and when Hergé was blacklisted for having collaborated or for having been perceived as a collaborationist with the Nazis. Hergé was blacklisted and for a while was not able to work, was not able to publish. But his friend Raymond Leblanc came to his rescue, and that marked the beginning of a new era for Tintin, who would start appearing not on Le Soir or Le XXe Siècle as before, but in the new Tintin magazine. On a personal level, the creation of this adventure was plagued by anxiety and tremendous stress, which would become a recurrent health issue for Hergé for the rest of his life. And his collaboration with the great Edgar Pierre Jacobs also ended here when Jacobs insisted on co-authorship credit and Hergé refused. So Jacobs would go on to create another wonderful series that I recommend to everybody out there because it's also available in English, which is the series of Blake and Mortimer. But he quit working with Hergé, and a certain kind of rivalry ensued, at least for a little while. And that really is a very difficult moment in Hergé's life right after World War II, when he was publishing The Seven Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun. And in fact, for many weeks during the publication, weekly publication of Prisoners of the Sun in Tintin magazine, he was nowhere to be found. He wasn't able to continue the story on certain weeks. He had to rush the ending of the story with which he was not satisfied. And so, as I said, it was a difficult period in Hergé's life right after World War II. So this is a time when he decides to pick up an adventure that had remained unfinished before the war for the next album after Prisoners of the Sun. It is an adventure that he recovers, that he rescues from years before, and it's called, in the English translation, Land of Black Gold. There it is. Land of Black Gold had to be revised for many reasons, not least of all the fact that Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus had not yet been created when the story was begun. This is really a solo Tintin and Snowy adventure with a kind of cameo appearance by the captain and the professor. This adventure would be revised once again in the 1970s at the request of Hergé's British publisher, Methuen and Company, who called for a more modernized version. Some scenes were deleted, and the fictional country of Gemed was created. All of this had to do with the British involvement in the creation of the State of Israel, which these days in 2024 is at the forefront of the news. And by the 1970s, when the Land of Black Gold was going to be published in a British edition, Methuen and Company asked Hergé to change certain things, not necessarily things that had to do with the visual aspect of the story, as it had happened already with the Black Island, but more with historical and political events that are depicted in Land of Black Gold, a lot of them having to do with the British involvement in the creation of the State of Israel, which would have been seen and considered as anachronistic by British readers in the 1970s. And of course, Hergé complied, and that's the reason why we have really three versions of Land of Black Gold: the one that was unfinished in Le Petit Vingtième, the one that Hergé picked up and finished in the Journal Tintin, Tintin magazine, and then the version of the 1970s, which is the one that you can find here, and the most widespread version of it, the one that most readers are familiar with. Dr. Müller, the evil Dr. Müller, returns here as the main villain, and we hear from the Portuguese tradesman Oliveira da Figueira again, but one character that first appears here that will become a household name is Abdullah, the son of Emir Ben Khalishat Sab, who will reappear in later stories, such as the Red Sea Sharks, an adventure. The Red Sea Sharks, by the way, that as we will see, is more or less a follow-up for this one, Land of Black Gold. And somehow Hergé is able to include, in a masterful way, in a very witty manner, Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus without really including them and without really explaining why Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus are not part of the story. The reason is that the story had been started and then interrupted before those characters had ever been born, or before these characters had entered the Tintin universe. But Hergé is able to bypass that, and The story may not be one of the most successful, may not be one of the best known ones, but it is an interesting story nonetheless, and one with many, as we can see, many different versions. Then Hergé decides to create another two-part adventure, and in this case we're talking about one of the best known, one of the most popular, and also one of the most iconic of Tintin adventures. We're talking about the lunar adventure, Destination Moon on the one hand, that's the first part, and Explorers on the Moon is the second part. Destination Moon is also the title of a science fiction movie that has to do with space travel that was an important influence on Hergé when creating this lunar adventure. And in French, Explorers on the Moon is actually called On a marché sur la Lune, which means we have walked on the moon. But the English title is Explorers on the Moon. Another two-part adventure and one of the most iconic installments in the Tintin series, which sees Tintin and company, because we also have Captain Haddock, we also have Professor Calculus, of course, and we also have the Thompsons, the detectives, and Snowy, of course, landing on the moon 2 decades before Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were able to do so. So it wasn't the Americans that made it to the moon first. It was Tintin and company working from the fictional country of Seldavia. Calculus is again the driving force behind this adventure. It's very interesting how this character has been the driving force already behind a couple of adventures and would continue to be the driving force behind adventures in the future, particularly the Calculus Affair. His name appears even in the title of that one. Calculus is the one who summons Tintin and Haddock to Seldavia to participate in this history-making mission. Hergé's documentation was extensive for this story because he wanted the scientific context to sound most of all believable. He didn't want to just delve into science fiction without bearing in mind that this had to be a story that was as believable as possible at the time. This adventure also reflects the contemporary space race taking place during these early Cold War years, and of course opposing the United States and the USSR, with its depiction of foreign powers conniving to thwart the moon mission. This is also going to be an important part of this story. And just like we had seen in previous two-part stories, the first part is the preparation for the adventure, and the second part is the mission itself. So Destination Moon, right here, Destination Moon is the preparation for the trip. Tintin and Captain Haddock are summoned to Seldavia by Professor Calculus. That's on the Destination Moon, and all the preparations for the trip and all the scientific explanation for the mission appears in that first part. And the second part, Explorers on the Moon, is the actual mission itself. The moon landing, the exploration of the moon, and the return back to Earth. The narrative, of course, as you would expect in this kind of story, is laden with tension and a whole lot of suspense. I can definitely stress that. Lots of tension, lots of suspense, and done in a really masterful way by Hergé. His tendency towards realism also kept him from the temptation of including aliens or any kind of fantastic creatures. Again, he wants this adventure, as far-fetched as it might have seemed in the early 1950s, to sound and to be perceived as an adventure that is as believable as possible. The landscape of the moon is therefore dark and minimalist, but very realistic. When Armstrong and Aldrin got to the moon, well, they realized, or Tintin readers realized, and Hergé himself realized, that the depictions of the moon in this lunar adventure were not that different from reality. We also have here the character of Frank Wolf, or Wolf, or Wolf, I don't know, but I suppose that the pronunciation would be Frank Wolf. A very interesting character, because he is a villain who is not necessarily a villain, but who becomes one because of his addiction to gambling and ends up committing suicide. This happens, of course, in Explorers on the Moon, in an attempt to save the rest of the expedition members. So Wolf is one of my favorite characters in all of the Adventures of Tintin, and he only appears in this two-part adventure. And when at the end of the story, Captain Haddock, after he gets back to Earth, he states that he won't be returning to the moon, he may be speaking for Hergé as well. Because Hergé, after creating this masterful adventure, which really is a masterpiece within the Adventures of Tintin and within the history of comic books in general, Hergé turned away from this type of science fiction, and we're not going to see this type of science fiction again, even though there are some elements of UFOs and stuff like that in later stories, such as Flight 714. So that's the Moon Adventure, which has been published in one volume that includes both adventures and translated in English translation as well, in a book that I have and that I should have brought and shown. But anyway, I've done that in other videos in the channel. It's called Tintin on the Moon. So Tintin on the Moon would include these two stories if you would like to have them that way in English translation. Next story is a very important one, and it's one of my favorites, and it's one that is generally seen as one of the best adventures in the series of the Adventures of Tintin. And it's this one right here that we mentioned before, called The Calculus Affair. This adventure, The Calculus Affair, cannot be fully understood without bearing in mind the contemporary context of the Cold War, which was going on in the 1950s when this story was being created and published. The Cold War really shapes one of the most memorable installments in the series of Tintin, a suspense-ridden tale of espionage with calculus again at its center. So once again, we have calculus at the center of the cover, but also on the title. L'affaire Tournesol in French, the Calculus Affair. Calculus is the one who invents a machine that can destroy glass at a distance by means of ultrasounds. And this, of course, could easily be turned into a weapon of mass destruction, and opposed world powers want to take control of it. Seldavia is one, Borduria is the other, and there we have the enactment or reenactment of this Cold War situation, and also a very interesting idea, which is the use or the negative use of technology, or the dangerous use which this kind of technology could actually have if it falls into the wrong hands. The story takes Tintin and Haddock first to Switzerland and then to Borduria. And here we get to see this rival country of Seldavia presented as a country that is on the other side of the Iron Curtain, governed by the dictator Courbitache, which in the French would be plexiglas, but the English translators, um, due to the fact that this is a dictator that has a physical feature, which is very stylish and very prominent mustache, then they take the word scurvy and tash, and that's the name that they use for the translation of Plexiglas, the dictator of Borduria. In King Ottokar's scepter, Borduria stood for Nazi Germany. Now it's more like communist Russia or Poland. Some new characters will also surface here. We have Colonel Spons, who would appear later on under a different name, and Jolion Wag, that's Séraphin Lampion in the original French, the insurance man. There's no one with endurance like the man who sells insurance, which is the old song from the 1920s stated, and I think Jolion Wag is a good example of that by now really obscure but very funny Frank Crumit song from the 1920s. The Calculus Affair, in my opinion, is one of the Adventures of Tintin with a deeper meaning, and also an excellent thriller with a great deal of action and suspense, and a very surprising ending that I will not unveil here, but I will not reveal here, but I will say that this is possibly the Tintin adventure that could be most easily be turned into a thriller, into a movie. And there's a lot of resemblance here with the universe of the British filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock. This is a very Hitchcockian thriller, so to speak, the Calculus Affair. And to finish this video, we're going to stop after this one, and then we'll pick up where we leave off here in the third installment of the series with Tintin in Tibet. But what we have here is the Red Sea Sharks. The Red Sea Sharks, just like Land of Black Gold, is perhaps one of the series' lesser known installments, the one that has not been written about as much. And it's a story that works, as we said before, a little bit like a follow-up to Land of Black Gold. It's also a thriller, partly set in the fictional Hamed that also appeared in Land of Black Gold, and it sees the return of familiar characters such as, once again, Dr. Müller, who's very active in that part of the world, and now has taken on a different name, a different identity, as Mol Pasha. We also have Rastapopulus, known as the Marquis of Gorgonzola. You can see that Hergé likes to use different names, assume names for certain of his characters. We have Sheikh Babelair, Emir Benkalish Sab, Oliveira da Figueira, the Portuguese tradesman, appears again. Abdullah, the son of Benkalish Sab, is also here. So by the late 1950s, when this adventure is created, Hergé had come up with a full cast of characters that he can reuse in different contexts. And here we have characters like General Alcazar, we have Alan, we have Dawson, who had appeared in the Blue Lotus the last time, which, had been created several decades before. Well, these characters exist in the Adventures of Tintin. They exist in the mind of Hergé, and he recovers these characters. He reuses them and puts them in a different context, a little bit like what Balzac, Honoré de Balzac, was doing in the 19th century in a series of novels and in works such as La Comédie Humaine, for example. The point of departure here for Red Sea Sharks, by the way, it is called in French coq en stock, coke in stock, because coke in this case is a word that is used to a code word in this case to talk about certain cargo that is transported illegally inside certain ships in this story on the Red Sea. The point of departure is a newspaper expose of modern-day slavery. Yeah, a very serious issue, which Hergé works into the story, perhaps hoping that this would make up for the stark criticism against Tintin in the Congo decades earlier. As it turned out, it didn't work out that way. As it turned out, Hergé was criticized now for the dialect that he used for the African slaves, and this is something that he will actually change at the request of the publishers in later editions of this story. So yeah, modern-day slavery is something that Hergé was worried about after reading an article about it, and decided to work it into this Tintin story, which is a fast-paced thriller that marks the first appearance of the Estonian pilot Skut, or Schut in the original French, and this character will reappear years later in Flight 714. Perhaps the weaker element is the rather abrupt ending, which I will not reveal either, but Hergé's awareness of the different personalities of the characters that he has created is very obvious now, and he is using them in very effective ways. He plays with these characters, he experiments with them in very interesting ways and in very interesting contexts. Personally, for Hergé, though, this is a moment of turmoil in his life. He is a very successful author, of course, and his Tintin books are selling by the millions, not just in the French-speaking world, but worldwide. But his marriage is falling apart. He was married to Germaine Kikens for many years, but a new woman appears in his life, the much younger Fanny Vlamink, and this will bring about the final collapse of his marriage to his first wife, Germaine. Hergé and Fanny will start a new life together and would eventually marry, but for now, the psychological strain keeps mounting and mounting and mounting, and will soon be reflected in Hergé's work if it hasn't been reflected already, which I think it already has, but that becomes even clearer on Tintin in Tibet. And in Tintin in Tibet, one of the reasons why the story is so white and the color of white is so prominent in Tintin in Tibet has to do with the psychological strain under which Hergé was working, not just because of being overworked, which he was, but also because of the personal situation, his private life, his personal life, and the collapse of his marriage, and his relationship with this new woman who years later will become his second wife, and now his widow. But we will pick up where we leave off here. I'm going to stop this brief overview of The Adventures of Tintin by Hergé. This is the second video in a series of 3, and we will start the third video hopefully soon. Hopefully it won't take 3 years with one of the best known and most interesting adventures of Tintin, which is Tintin in Tibet. I hope you enjoyed this second part of this 3-part series of videos with a brief overview, featuring a brief overview of The Adventures of Tintin by Georges Remi, better known as Hergé. And I, of course, encourage you to watch the first installment if you haven't done so yet. I will leave the link in the description of this video, and I encourage you also, if you have any comments to make, to just leave them underneath the video, and of course we can start a conversation about The Adventures of Tintin, which are one of the most important series of comic books in the history of the graphic novel, both in Europe and worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for any comments that you might leave underneath the video. I encourage you most of all to find the Adventures of Tintin, and if you already have them, to dust them off and reread them, because every time I reread an Adventure of Tintin, I find something new, and I feel like you are also bound to do so. I'll be interested in knowing what you think about Hergé, what you think about the Adventures of Tintin, and of course I'll see you again in the third and final installment of this brief overview of Hergé's Adventures of Tintin. My name is Anton Garcia, signing off from Jackson, Tennessee, here in the United States of America. Thank you, and so long, everybody.